All right, in today's lesson, we're going to cover the three errors that you most commonly find in computer programming. This is going to be from the 5.01 notes. Again, it's pretty short notes, so we're not going to spend too much time on this, but we're going to talk about the three errors. And today we're going to use a program as an example of how to kind of see these errors in your coding. Errors happen all the time in coding, and one of the hardest things about these errors is they can be sometimes very difficult to find or difficult to find in the coding itself. So if you know what you're looking for, then that can kind of help you identify what type of error it is. And if you know what type of error it is, then you can usually fix the problem at that point. So looking at our coding here, or in our form here, we have a form with a text box 1, a button 1, and also a label 1. Let's go look at our comments or our coding real quick. Here you can see that I have a program that's going to demonstrate the different types of programming errors. And remember, there are three types of programming errors that we've learned from class. There's syntax, there's logic, and there's runtime. Now the key to these errors is kind of how they function. A syntax error will not allow the program to run. In other words, something is written wrong in the program, so therefore your program will not run. A logic error is when the program runs but spits out an output or some value that isn't what you expected. In other words, the program works, there's no problem with how you've typed the coding, but something is messed up. Maybe you added when you meant to subtract. Maybe you multiplied when you meant to add, so on and so forth. Finally, we have our runtime error. A runtime error, the program will run, but something happens while you're running it, and it causes the program to crash. Okay, so again, a runtime error is when the program runs, but then something happens, and the program crashes at that point. Now let me give you an example of a syntax error. So one of the most common ones will be if you misspell something or you write something incorrectly. So let me give you an example. Let's say we try to declare a variable, and we'll call it int number, and then we'll say as integer. All right, now this right here is a proper way to declare a variable. And you can see here we have our dim int number as integer. We don't give it initial values. This has an initial value of 0. Now, if I want to make this a syntax error, if I want the program not to run with a syntax error, I would delete probably any part of this would cause that to happen. Let's say I delete the dim. All right. Now, the first thing you should notice is there's a little red line, kind of red squiggly line that occurs underneath my int number. This means that I've declared a variable incorrectly, or it's missing something. In other words, the program cannot and will not run until this is done. Now, if you look at our error list, you can usually see the error list right below. You'll see here the error list at line 8, which is exactly where this is, tells me that there's a declaration expected. And from what we know in programming, this is going to be our dim. So if I put dim back on here, all right, notice now everything is fine. Or for example, let's say I misspell message box. I say message box. Instead of saying show, I just say message box, and then I try to write something in the message box like hello world. Once again, you can see here I have another red squiggly line. And then once again, this will not run the program. This is an example of a syntax error. Again, if you look at the output, or the error list, you can again see that there is some error here with the message box. And again, this is a syntax error. You've written something wrong, and the program does not work. The program does not work. So let's take a look at a logic error. So let's say for a logic error, we have two numbers here. So let's say int num is equal to integer, and then we'll say int num2, and this will also be an integer. This one will be equal to, say, 6 for sake of example. Let's say in our button click, we want to, when we click on the button, we want to add the two numbers together. So I'm going to write a comment that says, adds the two numbers together when the button is clicked. Again, so the point of button 1 is to add the numbers together. That's very important. So when I click on this button 1, again, this button 1 right here, I'm going to add these two numbers, int num and int num2. Now, let's make another variable just for sake of argument, and we'll call this total. So this will be where both our numbers go. And instead, we'll write total is equal to int num, or int number, times int number 2. And then I say I want to output this to a label. So label1.text is equal to total. All right, so again here, nothing's crazy. All we've done so far is we've put our two variables, and if we multiply them together, and so that gives us our total, and total goes into our output, our label1.text. Now, this will run. So if I actually click on start, and if I actually run this program, oops, the generate failed unexpectedly. Let me fix that real quick. Give me one sec. Alright, so we're back again. Again, the program didn't run because of what was called the generate resources failed unexpectedly. And what happens is there's a OBJ folder in your project folder. And if you ever see that error come up, you just need to delete that OBJ folder and then the program will run again. So picking up on where we left off, you can see here the program is running fine. And now if I click on button 1, this program will actually run. All right, again, you can see here what's actually happened is my total is now equal to the integer or the number 1 and number 2, and I've multiplied those together to get me 18. You can see that right here in my output. But this is still a problem. Remember, what is my program supposed to do? What is my button supposed to do? My button is supposed to add the two numbers together. This is an example of a logic error. In other words, the program compiles, everything works, but you're not getting the answer you were looking for. All right, so this is a good example of a logic error. This is the hardest error to spot. Now you might say this is pretty easy. I can tell I multiplied here when I meant to add. But when your program gets bigger and bigger, it can be very difficult to spot where these errors are. So again, this would be an example of a logic error. The program works, but did something you were not expecting it to do. All right. Now let's look at a runtime error. So let's say I want to take in the input and then I want to multiply that. All right, so let's say I want to take in the input. This time I'm going to say when I click on the button, I'm going to take in the input and multiply it by int num2. And let's say my input, I'm going to set my input. Again, I do have a text box. I'm going to set that equal to int num. So I'm going to say int num equal textbox1.text. All right. And once again, this is pretty straightforward. We've done this before. All right, so int num is equal to textbox1.text. Now if I want to multiply int num, all right, and then we want to multiply this times our int num2, so we would say int number, so our original variable, times int num2. Again, this goes back to our rule of whatever's on the left side of the equal sign, it's going to take whatever's on the right side of the equal sign. So let's go ahead and run the program. Let's make sure this works. All right, so again, once again, I have my program here. Let's say I put in the number, 2. So if I put in number 2, that means 2 is in my text box, and 2 goes into int num. Remember, int num before was 3, but now I'm overriding that 3 with a 2. So now 2 times 6 should give me 12. All right, and it should give me 12. Oh, wait, before I do that, though, I have to actually set my label 1 to my int number. All right, sorry about that. So now if I click on my button, if I put 2 in here, you should now see this becomes 12. All right, pretty straightforward. Now, this program works. There are no errors, no logical errors. But let's say we want to make a runtime error. Remember, a runtime error is when the program works, but then it receives something it's not expecting and crashes. So let me give you a really good example. Remember, this text box is going into a integer variable. Int num right here is an integer. Again, we declared it as an integer. So let's say I put in a string. Let's say I put in the word Bob. Bob is a string value, B-O-B. If I click on button 1, the program will not accept Bob into my int number. Remember, when I click on button 1, whatever's in text box 1 will go into my int number. So if I click on my button, you can see here my program crashes and it highlights this coding right here. Int number equals textbox1.text. This is an example of a runtime error. The program worked, everything looked good, but then I put in something the program could not expect, or in other words, it could not compile properly. I put in the string value Bob when the program was expecting a number, and so it crashed the program. This is the most common way most of you will run into some form of a runtime error. You put in a string value that your program is expecting a number, and so therefore your program will actually crash. So the way to solve this is to right now just kind of be careful with what you put in. And we're going to learn in the next lesson, what can we do to prevent this from happening? So we don't want the program to crash every time we put in a string value when it's expecting a number. All right? But this is a good example of a runtime error. So let me go and stop the program, and we'll stop right there. Again, these are the 3 types of errors that we have. We have our syntax, our logic, and our runtime. All right? So make sure you understand which error comes in at which point.